All right, so this is one of the most important moments in biblical history, and that is not an overstatement. The people of Israel have come to Mount Sinai, and this is the point where they will enter into their covenant agreement with God. This is when they, we might use the term formally, become His people. He told Abraham long ago in Genesis 12 that there would be a great nation of people that would come from him. This is that nation. And he told Abraham that that nation of people would have a land in which to dwell. And that nation is journeying to that land. God is fulfilling those promises that He made to Abram long ago. And this is the point at Mount Sinai where this covenant agreement is entered into by both parties, and this formal process of becoming His people. I don't really have a better way of saying that, but that happens here at Mount Sinai. Now, I want you to notice that Exodus 19 through the rest of the book all occurs at Mount Sinai. So when we finish Exodus 40, we're still at Mount Sinai. Okay, so it's about half of the book of Exodus takes place at Sinai. So God in chapter 19 is going to offer this covenant to the Israelites. There's going to be some terms and some conditions that they will agree to. And they will confirm this covenant or ratify this covenant in chapter 24 with an ancient covenant-making process. Okay? So, Exodus 19, start reading with me at verse 1. On the third new moon, after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They set out from Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. There Israel encamped before the mountain, while Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you shall speak to the people of Israel." I want you to notice what God says to them in verse 5. There is a really important, big word in verse 5. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant. If, okay? God gives them a conditional covenant. You know, we understand this idea of a covenant, although we don't usually talk like that, except for maybe when it comes to marriage. We oftentimes may speak of a marriage covenant, which is an agreement between a man and a woman, where vows are made to one another and done so before God. We talk about the marriage covenant. But we engage in covenants all the time, even if we don't really think of it that way. How many of you have a credit card? That's a covenant, right? You requested the credit card, and what did they send you in the mail, or maybe digitally now, when you applied for the credit card? What did you get? The terms and the conditions, right? And then you agreed and you said, okay, when I make charges on this card, I will pay those charges. I will repay that debt. That's a covenant. Now, it's not nearly as important as maybe something as the marriage covenant, right? But it's still a covenant. You gave your word. You agreed to those conditions and to those terms. In the business world, let's say you work in construction, and you meet with a client who wants you to do some work for them, and so you give them an estimate, you give them a bid, You may give them a contract even. And they will read through that and say, okay, if you do this work for me, I will pay you this much money. You do the work, they pay the money. You've come to an agreement. That's a covenant that exists between you. We engage in these kinds of arrangements every day. We don't usually think about it. But God enters into this agreement with the nation of Israel here. If you will obey my voice, then you will be my treasured people among all the nations. So, Moses comes to the people in verse 7. He tells them what God has said. The people answered in verse 8, everything that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And so Moses says, understand, this is what God said. You've got to be obedient to him. You've got to be faithful to him. And in verse 9, the Lord said to Moses, I am coming to you in a thick cloud that the people may hear when I speak with you and may also believe you forever. So now, Mount Sinai is going to become a wondrous sight to behold. You read this in advance of class. I know you did. So I want you to tell me, what are some of the things that happen at Mount Sinai? What are some of the sights and the sounds? What happens here? There's thunder and lightning that's mentioned at the mountain. What else? Fire and smoke. Okay, what else? The mountain is trembling. I think somebody else over here said that the mountain was shaking. Anything else? Sound of a trumpet. Okay, so a loud burst of a sound. And I'm not exactly sure what to make of that. You know, was there like some actual trumpet off in the distance, or was it the sound like a trumpet? You know, I'm not exactly sure what to make of that. But there was a loud crashing thunder and all of these noises that were going on. This would have been an incredible sight to behold. And then the voice of God is going to speak to them soon. So this would have been a wondrous thing to see. But the people are told to make some preparation, because on the third day, in 3 days, God is going to come and speak to them. So if you look at verse 14, Moses went down from the mountain to the people and consecrated them, and they washed their garments, right? They're going to appear before the Lord, not in dirty, soiled garments, but in washed clothes. And he says to them, be ready for the third day. There's a prohibition of sexual relations there in verse 15. The idea is dedication, focus. What is about to happen is important. Don't become distracted or encumbered with other things. You're about to meet God. So then on verse 16, on the morning of the third day, there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain, loud trumpet blasts so that all the people in the camp trembled. Call to action, call to attention, right, is the idea of the trumpet blast. Then Mount Sinai, verse 18, was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on the mountain in fire. Now verse 21. The Lord said to Moses, go down and warn the people lest they break through to the Lord to look, and many of them perish. And let the priests who come near to the Lord consecrate themselves, lest the Lord break out against them. And Moses said, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you yourself warned us, saying, set limits around the mountain, consecrate it, don't touch it. Any man or beast who touches the mountain was to be killed. And the Lord said, go down and come up, bringing Aaron with you, but do not let the priests and the people break through to come up to the Lord. So Moses went down to the people and he told them. And then in chapter 20, God is going to speak and give them the 10 Commandments and the other laws as well, which we'll come to. But it begins with the 10 Commandments. All right, before we get into those 10 Commandments, anything else from chapter 19? Right.
But it's interesting that here it doesn't outline consequences for disobedience. And I didn't see it in chapter 20. Any of what we read, I'll be interested. Maybe I missed it, but I'll be interested
Yes, that's exactly what I was about to say, yeah.
This is the God you want to worship. This is a God worthy of our obedience and
Yes. If you do not obey my voice. Do you remember all those frogs you saw in Egypt? Yeah. Yeah, right. He doesn't even have to give that warning at this point, right? Jake? Okay, Bryce?
I was actually going to say something about verse 5 as well. I've got a note from something that we kind of overlooked. We were just looking at this, the English translation of these words. But when he says, indeed obey, that's the same Hebrew word twice, shema, which is hear or obey. It's used again in chapter 22, verse 23. And there it's translated surely hear. God saying he will surely hear. So it kind of indicates this exemplary. It's also like the idea in Isaiah, holy, holy, holy. God's holy.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's this utmost love.
Redundance, yeah.
Hearing, it will surely happen, that kind of idea, which I think adds to the significance here.
Good. Yeah, okay, good. Joe?
Can't help but think about the contrast between when Jesus comes versus this as far as the approachability of God. Just there's this, these boundaries and this strictness showing the holiness of God. And to me, that really enhances how approachable Christ was when he was on earth.
Hebrews 12 makes that exact point when the writer says, you've not come to Mount Zion, surrounded by smoke and lightning, and he doesn't use the word unapproachable, but that's the idea. He says, but you, Christian, have come to Mount Zion, the city of the living God, right? Yeah, excellent idea. All right. So the Lord speaks in chapter 20 and verse 1. God spoke these words, saying. Now, everybody turn your God voice on in your head, right? Whatever voice you have of God speaking, hear that when he says, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Now, I'm not going to read through all those 10 commandments, but I want you to just get the sense of God speaking to the people. They are hearing his voice as they're seeing this mountain surrounded by fire and smoke, and thunder is rumbling in the background, and lightning is flashing, and they hear this voice saying, I am the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. And when they hear this voice, the reaction of the people is to be totally stunned. Let's skip ahead. We'll come back to the commandments, but look at verse 18. When the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled. And they stood far off and said to Moses, you speak to us and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us lest we die. The Israelites are so terrified at what they are experiencing. They turn to Moses and say, you go talk to God, and then come back and talk to us. We can't take this. We can't listen to this. And so Moses, it says in verse 21, drew near to the thick darkness where God was. I wonder how gingerly Moses was walking. How intimidated would you be to inch closer and closer to that thick cloud and that darkness? But this is truly an awesome sight that the people are experiencing. Now, these commands that are given, the 10 commandments, we call them. It would be really great if you could memorize these. But we certainly want our children to be memorizing these commandments. Let's talk about these for just in kind of a general way. I think this is familiar territory. We obviously can't say everything about everything, but general observations. I'm not even going to get the ball rolling. I'm just going to let you do that. When you think about the Ten Commandments, what stands out to you? What do you see? What do you think about? What should we all be thinking about? Not everybody at once.
The first half is man's relationship with God. The second half is man's relationship with each other.
You know, Jimmy has just touched on one of the most ancient controversies about the Ten Commandments, and he didn't even know it. Did you? So Jimmy's comment was, the first half of the commandments, the first 5, have to do with man's relationship to God. The second half has to do with man's relationship to other men. Do you see a problem with that? What? Is Jimmy right? That half are about... No, hang on. You had your... Be quiet, Jimmy. No, I agree with you. Okay? I do. But does commandment number 5 seem like a problem? What does that have to do with our relationship to God? It says honor your father and your mother. That's human interaction, isn't it? And so this was one of the ancient controversies among the Jews about how best to understand this. Because, after all, how many tablets of stone were there for the 10 Commandments? There were 2 of them, right? And there's 10 commandments, and God is a God of order and precision, so surely God wouldn't put 4 commandments on one tablet and 6 on the other, because that would be asymmetrical. And if God is anything, He's a God of symmetry, surely. The Jews argued at length about this. Okay? So let me throw this out there. Number 5, honor your father and your mother. Earthly fathers teach us about whom? Our Heavenly Father. Seems to me like commandment number 5 is a really nice transition from the commandments about our relationship with God to the commandments about our relationship with our fellow man. Seems to flow quite naturally to me. So I don't know how many commandments were on each of the 2 stones. It doesn't really matter to me. But there were some who insist, no, it was 5 and 5. Maybe it was. Doesn't matter. Jimmy, I like your point. I think you're onto something. Good. What else do we see about the 10 Commandments, Jerry?
I was thinking that it's possible, some people think so, but each tablet had all the 10 Commandments. It's like a contract. You got a copy, you got a copy.
Yes. Good. Yes. Very possible. I like that idea too. Matt?
2 do's and 8 don'ts.
Okay. So there's more don'ts than there are do's. Here's the things you should not do versus the things you should do. Okay? Good. What else? Alan?
First commandment. All the other ones, 2 through 10, are seen through the filter of the first commandment.
Okay. So Alan says the first one is the primary one, and all the other ones are somehow related to that, you think. Okay? What else do you think? Jeff?
Kind of go along with what Alan said and what we originally had there are 2 different things. To me, it's one thing is talking about this is how you honor, respect, look at the Creator and His creation.
Yeah, good.
And there is nothing else. There's a Creator and His creation. And this is it.
Yeah. Okay, good. The first and great commandment is love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength, right? I know that comes later. It comes in Deuteronomy. But the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Do you see those 2 things here on the board? Love God, love your neighbor. Yeah. Okay, good. Commandment number 4, Sabbath day. We saw that in our last class when we had the discussion in Exodus 16 about the manna, and they were told, gather up the bread that you need, 1 person for 1 day, but the 7th day is a Sabbath. Don't collect any then. Now we're getting into some specific legislation. And this is just the first general, remember the Sabbath day. There's going to be a lot more to come about the Sabbath, but here is where it is first codified into law. Lance?
Just something about the 10 Commandments. Later
Next 5. Yeah, exactly.
Whenever you won't steal from, you won't covet from. If you love God, you won't have any other false gods. You'll make sure you won't take anything. You'll remember His holy.
Yes, good. Excellent. Okay, very good. Now, let's look back to chapter 20. As I look back, let's look at chapter 20, verse 22. This was on the previous slide. We can jump back on the slide, but let's look at this. Verse 22. The Lord said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the people of Israel, you've seen for yourself that I've talked with you from heaven. You shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourself gods of gold. No other gods before me. Don't make any graven images. Don't make gods of silver. Don't make gods of gold." And what are they going to do in 10 chapters? 40 days later, 40 days from now, they're going to do that. Okay, they're going to make that golden calf and start worshiping that golden calf, even after they said, all that the Lord has commanded we will do. Joe?
What's the timeline here? Because looking at verse 18, it doesn't say that they heard the voice of God. So is it up to this point the Ten Commandments were only communicated to Moses? That's the impression I got. It's not necessarily that the whole world heard all this.
All right, so there's a couple of ideas about that. And this doesn't really address time frame necessarily. I mean, this is all happening on that third day. When God said in chapter 19 to Moses, "Tell them on the third day, I'm coming down to the mountain." So I think chapter 20 happens on that day. But to the question about what did the Israelites hear, or was this just to Moses, right? Okay, so there's a couple of ideas about that. One is chapter 20, verse 1, the Lord God spoke all these words. And then later in verse, as we just read, verse 22, you have heard that I've talked with you from heaven. And so one idea is God spoke all of the commandments in their hearing. Everybody heard His voice. Okay? The other idea, and this is something I had never come across until recently, if you look at chapter 20 and the way the commandments are spoken, this is interesting. Verse 2, I am the Lord your God. Verse 3, you shall have no other gods before me. Verse 5, I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Verse 6, those who love me and keep my commandments. Then it shifts in verse 7. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not. Verse 10, the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You see how it shifts there from first person, God says, me, my, I, to the Lord your God. Third person, the Lord your God, the Lord your God. So there are some who think that God only spoke audibly the first, 4 commandments, and then it shifts to the third person, and maybe only Moses heard those. I don't find that quite as compelling, but I do notice the transition from first person to third person. Does that help? Sort of, but not really? You're kind. Sort of, but not really. Okay, we can talk some more about that if you need. All right, chapter 21. Oh, Matt, go ahead.
Well, there's another big misconception. People forget that this is all still part of the old law. We don't have to honor the Sabbath. Yes, we've been given a different day of the week to
Right.
honor and way. But all these things are repeated in the New Testament, which is why they end up being things we obey. But the world constantly says, oh, Ten Commandments, Ten Commandments. But that's just because it's a law that's been codified into our law here in the United States, but also because it's repeated in the New Testament, not
Sure.
because we're bound by this any more than the rest of all these things.
Was that the answer to your question? Because if it was, I completely missed your question. No. Okay, that was just a separate comment. Okay, I'm sorry.
I don't know the next time you're going to talk about it until we get to Deuteronomy, though, so I wanted to...
Yeah. Okay. No, I really thought I misunderstood. I thought you were answering Joe, and I thought, how did I get so off base? All right. What I really want to do here is skip 21, 2, and 3 and go to 24. Let's come back to 21, 2, and 3. Okay? Let's go to 24. And I have reasons for doing that. Chapter 24 is talking again about this covenant. And really, 24 flows more naturally from 19 and 20. 21, 22, and 23 is a whole bunch more legislation that Moses gives, and it just seems to interrupt the idea of the covenant. So I want to hit that, and then we'll go back to those chapters, okay? So, chapter 24, verse 1. He said to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar. Moses alone shall come near to the Lord, but the others shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him." Now, in chapter 24, they are going to ratify this covenant or confirm. The people are going to say again, everything that the Lord has said, we are going to do. And so this covenant is going to be finalized and entered into officially. Okay? So, verse 3, Moses came, told all the people the words of the Lord and all the rules. Now, that may be a reference to chapters 21, 2, and 3. All of those laws that were given, Moses brought all of those laws to the people and said, these are the commands of the Lord. And the people answered, all the words the Lord has spoken, we will do. Now, verse 4, Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. He sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half the blood he threw upon the altar. He took the book of the covenant, I want you to notice that language, and he read it in the hearing of the people. So the book of the covenant, that is all the things that the Lord has said that Moses has written down. All these commands, the 10 commandments, all these things that God has said to Moses, he writes them all down, he reads them to the people, and they say, we will do this. In verse 7, we will be obedient. So if I'm not mistaken, this is the third time in these chapters that they have said, whatever God says, we will do. Now verse 8. This is interesting. Moses took the blood and he threw it on the people, or he sprinkled it on the people. And he said, behold, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. And there are some other things that are done that speak to this covenant-making process. There's these animals that are sacrificed. Portions of it are eaten by Moses and Aaron and the others. They go through this, again, ancient custom, ritual of entering into this covenant. Here's what I want to emphasize. The blood of the covenant. I want you to think about what Jesus does when he's with his disciples. On the night that he is betrayed, he shares a cup with them. And he says, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, right? I want you to see that shadow. What is a shadow here that becomes a reality in the New Testament? Covenants are confirmed with blood in the Bible. And Jesus will draw upon that when the new covenant is initiated. Matthew 26, verse 28, specifically, you can read about that. Now, the Lord says to Moses, verse 12, come up to me on the mountain and wait there, that I may give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandment, which I have written for their instruction. That's that reference to the tablets of stone. It's actually not mentioned back in chapter 20. When the commandments are given. It's mentioned here. And then it's also mentioned later in chapter 32 when the people build the golden calf and Moses breaks these tablets of stone and then he has to get new ones and put those commandments on that. Okay. agreement, covenant, entered into this marriage, as it were, of God and Israel has begun officially. Okay. I think we need to talk a little bit about these laws in chapters 21, 22, and 23. When you read through those laws in those chapters, I'm sure that you didn't have any questions. No, you probably did, as I did. So I want to say some things about that, and hopefully the things that I say will be helpful to you. First of all, I want to say this. Don't get bogged down in the specific laws. That's not really the purpose of our class. Our purpose is to see the forest, not the branches of the trees. Okay? So we don't really have time to start working through all these passages and talk about each law and all of that kind of. We certainly don't have time to do that. I love how the bell reinforces the point that I'm making. Now, these laws that are given in these chapters and the laws that come later in books like Leviticus and Deuteronomy, these laws are really based in the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are kind of the simple versions of all of these laws. The Ten Commandments will say things like, well, don't steal. But then there will be more laws that are given later in Leviticus and Deuteronomy that get into some very specific kinds of scenarios wherein stealing might happen. And how do you deal with that, and so forth. But these are the basis. These 10 are the basis of all of those other laws. So there are laws in these chapters that deal with slaves or servants, is really the better idea. Personal injury, protection of property, social responsibility, feast days, all these kinds of things are discussed here. A couple of things I want you to understand about some of these laws. First, these are not just religious laws. For many of these laws, they are also civil laws. This is an actual nation that is going to have actual boundaries and property lines and possessions and property, cattle and flocks and herds and so forth. And there are real practical considerations that these laws have to speak to. And so you read about in chapter 21, or maybe it's 22, I forget, if an ox gores another man's servant. Well, that's not a religious law. That's a civil law. How do we deal with this when there is damage that's been done and restitution needs to be made, okay? So some of the things you're going to read about are civil in their nature, and they're a little bit strange perhaps because our customs are different and our times are different and that kind of thing. There are social norms and social institutions that existed in the ancient world that don't exist today. And so those laws had to reflect those ancient norms and institutions and things. And God was trying to make improvements to those. But he was operating within those systems that were currently in place. And then the second thing I want to mention is a lot of the laws that God gives in the law of Moses are intended to make Israel better incrementally. Okay? And here's what I mean by that. There are practices that were happening among the Jews that were really bad. They were not the things that God wanted to exist. But he couldn't just come along and say, nope, not going to do that anymore. You're going to stop this cold turkey. Because of the structures and the things that were in place in the institutions at the time, the Israelites just weren't ready for that. And so God has to take them where they are and give them laws that are manageable for them. Okay? So let me give you a real example, a specific example of what I'm talking about. We read in the law of Moses about how to handle issues of slavery or servitude. Now, understand, first of all, biblical slavery is not the same thing as 19th century American chattel slavery. The situations are not even comparable, okay? But modern Westerners, we read Exodus 21 about slavery, and we immediately think Frederick Douglass in the antebellum South. That's what our minds naturally do, okay? Even though that's not what was happening in the Bible. And we say, well, wow, look at these things that the Bible says about slavery. Well, why didn't God just say, hey, nope, no servitude, no slavery at all. Israel, we're not going to do that. Stop it. Because there were social structures that were already in place that were too complicated and too big of a thing for God to just say, nope, we're not going to do that. The people weren't ready for that. The ancient world wasn't ready for that. And so God is going to give them laws that will mitigate some of the abuses. It will make things a little bit better, even though it's still not the ideal that He's going to bring when Jesus comes. Does that make sense? There's probably more I could say about that, but I don't have time. So hopefully that helps, and we can talk some more about that if you need. Okay, thanks everybody.